How about this? Can everybody hear me?
Oh my God, yes.
Is that too loud?
No. Yes.
It is? You can't hear me when I'm sitting right across from you. Well, good evening, everybody. I'm glad all of you came out tonight. I hope this message is a blessing for everyone and all of you who will be watching later on YouTube. The message tonight is entitled Creation and You. And I know it's kind of a crazy title, but I'm hoping that as this goes along, it will all begin to make sense and it'll get tied together toward the end. Everybody knows that Genesis is the first book of the Bible. And Genesis, actually, the Hebrew word Genesis is in the beginning, which is actually the first three words of Genesis. But it's a book of origins and beginnings. It's a literal book of first things, first events, first occurrences. So what I want to do is I want to go through chapter 1 of Genesis and point out some of these things. And then again, like I said, as we go through this later on, I'm going to tie these events into how they apply to us. Okay? So for the first time in chapter 1 of Genesis, and remember, all of this entire message is about one chapter in Genesis. So we read for the very first time about a bunch of different stuff, like time, about God as being creator, and about all of the created things. Genesis 1:1 says, "In the beginning God created the heaven and the earth." We also read about darkness for the first time, about the Spirit of God, and about water in Genesis verse 2 of chapter 1. "And the earth was without form and void, and darkness was upon the face of the deep, and the Spirit of God moved upon the face of the waters." Now, through the 6 days of creation, we read for the very first time about God speaking. 9 times in chapter 1 alone, we read, "And God said, let there be," or some other creative act, such as "let the earth bring forth," or "let the waters bring forth." I think right here, it's also good to know the response to God's creative commands. It was so. That means that when God speaks, things happen. Genesis, I'm going to go through some of these just so you see how this happened in Genesis 1. In verse 3 it says, "And God said, let there be light, and there was light." Command, action. In verse 6, "And God said, let there be a firmament in the midst of the waters, and let it divide the waters from the waters." In verse 9, "And God said, let the waters under the heaven be gathered together unto one place, and let the dry land appear. And it was so." Again, creative command, action taken. Verse 11, "And God said, let the earth bring forth grass, the herb yielding seed, and the fruit tree yielding fruit after his kind, whose seed is in itself upon the earth. And it was so." Again, creative command, creative action. Now I want you to remember this verse in particular, because we're going to come back to it. I'm going to reference this again, and we're going to go into great detail about this a little bit later on. Genesis 1 verses 14 and 15, "And God said, let there be lights in the firmament of the heaven to divide the day from the night, and let them be for signs and for seasons and for days and for years, and let them be for lights in the firmament of the heaven to give light upon the earth. And it was so." Again, same thing. Verse 20, "And God said, let the waters bring forth abundantly the moving creature that hath life, and fowl that may fly above the earth in the open firmament of heaven." And verse 24, and God said, let the earth bring forth the living creature after his kind, cattle and creeping thing and beast of the earth after his kind, and it was so. We first read about light, which God names day, in Genesis chapter 1, verse 5. We read about the establishment of an expanse between the waters above it and below it, which God calls heaven. We read about that in verse 8. We read about dry land for the first time, which he names earth, and about all of the waters that are gathered together, which he calls seas, both of them in verse 10. We read for the first time about morning and evening and days, which are all measurements of time. We see this in verses 5, 8, 13, 18, 23, and 31. Now I want to interject something right here dealing with time. Okay? At the end of each day of creation, it ends with the phrase, and there was evening and there was morning of the first, second, third, fourth, fifth, sixth day. Right? There's been a lot of debate concerning the actual length of a day of creation. So was it a literal 24-hour day, like the Jewish and the Julian calendars indicate that it is? Or was each day a measurement of time, possibly even eons, years and years and years? They can't seem to agree on it. But I did a little bit of research, and I thought I would share this with you for what it's worth, okay? In the story of the crucifixion, in Mark 15, verse 25, and it was the third hour, and they crucified him. Mark 15, verse 33 says, and when the sixth hour was come, there was darkness over the whole land until the ninth hour. Now the third hour is 9 a.m. in the morning. The sixth hour is 12 noon. And the ninth hour is 3 p.m. Our day, according to the Julian calendar, begins at midnight. 12:01 begins our new day, right? But according to the Jewish calendar, their day begins at 6 a.m. in the morning. Evening starts at the 12th hour, which is 6 p.m. Now this appears to be backwards to conventional thinking. You'd think that it would that would read, and it was morning and evening the next day, the first, fourth, sixth, ninth, whatever, instead of it was evening and morning were the first day. Remember too, in 2 Peter 3:8, this is what God says, or what Paul says. He said, but beloved, be not ignorant of this one thing, that one day is with the Lord as 1,000 years, and 1,000 years as a day. Just a little food for thought, but I personally don't know. I don't have a clue, but I just thought it was very interesting. All I know is that he did all of this work in creation, and I get to enjoy it till I leave here. Oh, and by the way, when I was talking about the 9th and the 12th and the 6th and all those days, or all those hours in the day, did you know that in the New Testament, the 1st, the 2nd, the 4th, the 5th, the 8th, and the 12th hour are never mentioned anywhere in the New Testament? They're never mentioned. How weird is that? It's not like they didn't exist, but they're just never mentioned. We read for the first time about God's approval of his creative actions. That every time he did something, he saw it as being good. But when he creates man, he looks back on the whole of creation And he doesn't see it as good. He declares that it's all very good. We read again for the first time about grass, herbs, and fruit trees after their own kind. Again, in Genesis 1, 11, and 12. I told you we were going to get to this again, look into it, because there's some very interesting stuff here that I wanted to bring out. When you read this about grass and herbs and fruit trees after their own kind, this was God's way of dispelling the entire theory of evolution thousands of years in advance of the 20th century when it was included in school curriculums, when it was taught in school curriculums. After the famous Scopes monkey trial, 1925, that trial pitted two world-famous lawyers against one another, William Jennings Bryan and Clarence Darrow. It was a very highly publicized trial. And a couple of things, very interesting facts about the trial itself. Number one, William Jennings Bryan was the guy who defended the religious proponents, and it was Clarence Darrow who was the lawyer defending evolution being taught in schools. The guy that this whole trial was centered around was a man named John Scopes, who was a high school science teacher. But Scopes was a substitute teacher. He wasn't even the guy that was supposed to be there. He was taking over for the real science teacher who was out. And so he was the one who was doing this, and so they needed a person to teach it so that they could bring the trial out. And so he said, well, I'll do it. You know, I'm just a substitute. What have I got to lose? How little did he know? Okay, well, anyway, he wasn't even teaching from the book that we all generally identify as the book that teaches evolution. That book, by the way, was Charles Darwin's book called, and it had two titles, by the way. The first one was On the Origin of Species by Means of Natural Selection. The other title was The Preservation of Favored Races in the Struggle for Life. There are some folks I think should be very upset at a book like that. Now, the book that this guy actually used was a textbook, George William Hunter's textbook, and it was called Civic Biology Presented in Problems. And it dealt with evolution, it dealt with race, and it dealt with eugenics. Anybody know what eugenics is? You do? For those of you who don't, eugenics is basically the creation of a superior, desirable race of people to the exclusion of those who are deemed undesirable, disabled, elderly, infirm, and other minority groups. Can you say Nazi Germany? You know, the idea of plants and trees bearing seeds after their own kind hid the origins of DNA until the late 1860s. They didn't even know what DNA was. You know, it's funny. That's why DNA proves that whatever something is, it's going to continue to generate characteristics to be the same thing. Ever and ever and ever. That's why an antelope can't evolve into a sunflower. That's why a human being can't be a bale of alfalfa hay or a lizard or an eagle. That's why a water buffalo can't turn into a rose bush. DNA says that what you are now, your offspring will be just like you. They may not look precisely like you, but they will have all of the general characteristics that you have. Just like a rose bush will be a rose bush, and an oak tree will be an oak tree, and a rhinoceros will be a rhinoceros. It can never be anything else. We read for the first time about lights in heaven to separate day from night and to bring light to the earth, to be used for signs, seasons, days, and years. By the way, this is the first time that they're ever mentioned as well. We read about the two great lights for the first time. The greater of the lights, the sun, which was to rule over the daytime, and the lesser of the two lights, the moon, to rule over the night. For the first time, we read about the creation of fish and fowl, along with God's blessing, also mentioned for the first time, for them to be fruitful and multiply. We read for the first time about living creatures, cattle, creeping things, and beasts of the earth. Also about the creation of mankind in God's own image, both male and female, which, by the way, is the first time that gender is mentioned in the Bible. You know, I find it very interesting and very telling that only two genders are mentioned, male and female, even though for some reason we've got about 60 or 80 of them now. Don't know where they came from, but I can say this: woe to all of the systems of this world who are pushing this agenda. Okay, again, God blesses his creation. This time it's mankind whom he blesses and tells them to be fruitful and multiply. He gives them dominion over the rest of his all of his earthly creation. We read for the first time about God's provision of food through a diet, a vegetarian diet, by the way, because he says that human beings will eat seed-bearing herbs and fruit from fruit trees, all having seed after their own kind, and that is their diet, and a diet of green herbs for the rest of creation, except for fish, whose diet for some reason or the other is never mentioned. We don't know what they ate. Yeah, maybe, I don't know. God's final consensus over his created work is no longer merely good, but now it is very good. Now, even though we know that on the seventh day nothing else was created with the exception of another day, it was a day in which God ended all of his creative work and he rested. On that day he blessed it and sanctified it, because in that day he ceased all of his work of creation and rested. But day 7 is not part of chapter 1. It shows up in chapter 2. I just thought I'd mention that. So I look out here and I see a few blank stares, and I'm sitting here asking myself, well, you're wondering, why in the world did I bring you a message about beginnings and first things, right? Well, here's why. God created all of this for the human race, of which all of us are a part. We too have all been created in the image of God. We have all been blessed by him. We were all created to have fellowship with God. We were all created to love, to worship, and to serve God. We each have a need to do so. We were given an earth created with an abundance of God's blessings for us to enjoy. God did all the hard work of originally creating and establishing this paradise on earth for us to inhabit, with a mandate to work it, to maintain it, until he comes again. His only desire was to have a relationship with his creation. God created man to socialize with, to talk to bring them into a relationship with himself. And that's where each and every one of us comes in. Beginning at birth, we are pursued by God. The first thing we must do is hear God speaking to us, to have our hearts and minds tenderized by his word. We must singularly follow our hearts and be convicted of our sins, to first confess our sins and seek forgiveness by calling on the Lord, Romans 10:13 says, "For whosoever shall call upon the name of the Lord shall be saved." How simple is that? God gave us a pattern. For 6 days he worked, and he rested on the seventh day. For 6 days we are to work. We are to take this same message that saved each one of us to a yet unredeemed world. We're to pray for others. We're to pray for ourselves. We're to pray for God's kingdom, for our ministries, for our missionaries. And on the seventh day, we are to rest from our labors. We are to join together in praise and worship and celebration to our Creator God. And that, dear friends, is what we were created for. So the Lord bless thee and keep thee. The Lord make his face shine upon thee and be gracious unto thee. The Lord lift up his countenance upon thee and give thee peace. Shalom. Go with the peace of God. Thank you all. I appreciate it.